Due to an unexpected, unusual change in policy made by the Treasury last week, we've had to change our policy in how we were purchasing bonds on behalf of our clients. The federal government, the Treasury, announced last week that it's going to shift the mix of treasuries that it sells to more long-term treasuries. You can see that they're forecasting having to borrow even more to continue to fund our long-term deficit. And as a result of that, the policy that we had of buying 10-year treasuries with a mix of 5 and 10-year yields to maturity is not going to work as well. And so we're going to shift that to buying 90-day treasuries. Looking at the next graph, you can see that we're running deficit spending higher than we've done since World War II. And as a result of that, the government's having to issue treasuries for longer durations in order to pay for that continued deficit and debt spending. Looking at the next slide, you can see the reason why this is occurring. In the past, we've talked about this 2-10 inversion being a signal for recession. Here's the 10-year treasury running ahead of the 2-year. This is a normal yield curve. When that yield curve inverts, as it has for the last 12 months, that has predicted 11 of the last 10 recessions and corrections. Our plan had been to wait until the 2-year treasury begins to drop versus a 10, and that would be a signal of imminent correction and recession and a good time to begin looking at buying stocks across the bottom. We'll need more liquidity when that happens. Had we continued with the 10-year treasury, we would not have had enough liquidity when that begins. With the 90-day treasury, we believe we will. Looking at the next graph, we can see how the market and the Fed Open Market Committee have been at odds. The market all year long has been predicting that the Fed was going to lower interest rates throughout this year, probably at least 3 times. However, the Federal Reserve has maintained their policy, actually increasing interest rates last month and perhaps again this fall, because they're seeing the economy through 2 different lenses. The next slide shows us why that's different. Here is core inflation, CPI, which has been dropping very quickly. That's why the market thinks the Fed Open Market Committee should lower rates and let the economy ease up borrowing expenses so the economy can expand. What the Federal Reserve is concerned about is that core inflation, particularly wages and housing, while it's begun to tip over, may actually spike up against this fall. So that's why they're waiting until this fall, and I believe that they will stay true to their word. If they do see core inflation continuing to stay flat or go back up again, interest rates are likely to remain higher for longer. Now, looking at those causes of inflation, the next graph shows us the difference in both college-educated and blue-collar employment. While they've both begun to dip down, wages are still running at a 6% annualized rate for both of those groups. And as long as housing costs are near an all-time high and wages are so high, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, I do not believe, is going to lower rates prematurely. The chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, is well aware of the mistakes Arthur Burns made back in the 70s when Arthur Burns lowered rates too soon, and we had a decade of misery, literally what President Carter called the misery index. Generations that follow the baby boomers might be hard for them to recall or to imagine what it would be like to have double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, and mortgage rates in the high teens. Hard to believe that that could happen, but that's what we experienced the last time a Federal Reserve chair lowered interest rates too quickly. Looking at this graph, you can see that even in stronger terms, each of these pink bars marks inflations, recessions. And you can see that the current market that we're in, every time the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it almost inevitably leads to recession. And it's not just the US central bank. This is all central banks are raising interest rates like this now, battling inflation around the world. And again, almost inevitably leading to recession and correction. Looking at the next slide, you can see that the amount of debt that we're financing right now is significant, and the federal deficit is running counter to monetary policy. So while we have interest rates continuing to rise, trying to slow down the economy, we have a federal government continuing to spend more and more and more, injecting more money, overheating the economy. And so right now, the Federal Reserve and the administration and executive branch and legislative branch are at odds. The Fed on one side, the legislative and executive branch on the other side. Looking at the next graph, you can see again the historic amount of debt that we're financing here, that we're utilizing. If one goes back, the last time we had this much debt financing going on, it was World War II, when we had tens of millions of Americans engaged in the war effort to stop Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan. This is very unusual to have this much deficit financing. We understand we had COVID-19, we had to do some of that, but we've never run this much debt and deficit short of a wartime economy. Looking at the next slide, you can see that as we look at forward PE ratios, stocks are not terribly pricey right now relative to the COVID situation and going back to the great financial crisis. But looking at forward earnings, they're beginning to look more and more pricey. So if there were to be a stumble in the economy, if the economy does slow down and earnings come down, inevitably higher interest rates will lead to a market correction, and we want the portfolio to be positioned well for that. I'm Fred Baerenz, Chairman and President of AOG Wealth Management, and this is our announcement about the change in our bond policies.